Given a few minutes for everybody to settle in, and we're also setting our live stream on YouTube. Thanks. We do have amazing YouTube tutorials from our team. We'll just give it another minute before we start. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and give a quick intro. Welcome again to our fifth and second last workshop of the Secure Development Series. I'm Wichi, the events manager for OpenZeppelin, and I'm sure at this stage there's many of you who have joined our previous sessions and know about OpenZeppelin and what we do, but I do see some new names here, so please bear with me while I bring everyone to speed on what OpenZeppelin is and what we do. So, sorry, So OpenZeppelin is a security company. Our mission is to protect the open economy in the blockchain space, and we do this by working with other products and services in the industry. We have three offerings. Many of you know us from our open source smart contract library, Defender to automate smart contract operations, and we also work with the companies in the space to offer smart contract auditing. And quickly, I'd like to add that we are growing our team and there is many opportunities here that you'll find on our jobs page. You can type in zpl.in/join and you'll find many opportunities there, or you can submit a general application, which we will review. That's it from me. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A and we can go over them at the end of the session, and I'll leave you with Tincho to help you achieve the best practices in security when it comes to upgrades. Thank you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So glad to be here with you all again. I see some familiar names, some new names in the attendance, so that's great. We're going live on YouTube as well today, which is awesome. So yeah, the idea for today is talking about security and upgrades of smart contracts, continuing with this series of secure development that we are pushing from OpenZeppelin. So I will just share the screen as always, and we will get started. Awesome. Here we click present, and here we go. Perfect. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Martin. You can call me Tincho. I'm a security researcher at OpenZeppelin. We have been conducting this series of workshop sessions called the Secure Development. Today, the idea is talking about security in upgrades of smart contracts. A pressing topic, I would say today, for those that are looking forward for like updating your smart contracts already deployed on mainnet and these strategies for trying to change these pieces of code that supposedly are immutable, but we still want to change them, right? To fix bugs and to add new features and so on. Multiple reasons for upgrading. And the idea for today is, well, covering specific cases of issues and security problems when it comes to upgradability and how we should pay attention to these features and how we should get them right from day one. Otherwise, it will be kind of problematic in many ways. And we will see some examples of how things can go wrong, which is going to be interesting. As Kuchi was saying at the beginning, we have multiple videos about these sessions already uploaded on YouTube, and you can watch them. They are there for you. It's free. You can share them, spread the word, share them with your community. I think they are super insightful, and the reception from the community has been awesome. So thank you all for your feedback on this. On the first one, we talked about the dangers of token integration. We talked about on the second one on access controls and how to get them right. Then we covered the dangers of price oracles and what kind of subtleties these price oracles, which are a critical infrastructure of DeFi, may have. Then we covered like cases of different examples of governance and what are the best practices when it comes to building governance contracts on Ethereum and other chains. And today is the day of upgrades of a smart contract, right? And for the next session, we have something also special ready to talk about like some forward-looking ideas on what's coming for smart contract security and how do we see this space evolving. So I will look forward to that session as well, and I hope to see you there as well as you are today. As always, the idea is, yes, sharing the mindset. I will keep using this meme here. Regardless of each particular topic that we are covering in this series, I really want to convey the idea that security might go even beyond this, and we need to continue keeping our contracts safe and following secure development practices, right? We should be paranoid, we should be peer reviewing our contracts, we should be auditing them, we should be hiring security professionals for our teams so that our contracts and our DeFi systems and other systems on chain can be safe, right? We are already aware of what are the problems if contracts are not that secure. So the idea of the series is throughout all these sessions that we are working together is, well, let's try to build this mindset of keeping things secure. Today, it's about upgradability, as I said multiple times already. And you will ask probably what kind of upgrades are we talking about, right? Because probably there are many ways of upgrading a contract. You might be thinking, well, are we talking about changing just a parameter in a contract? Probably no. I mean, we're talking about a different kind of upgrades today that we will be covering. Some others might think that, well, there are other ways of changing the logic of contracts by doing migrations, which is okay, but by migration, I mean just redeploying your entire code base to new addresses and pointing your front ends to that. That might be a way of upgrading. You might be using registries. That means that in your smart contract system, there might be like a centralized place where your contracts query the addresses of other legitimate contracts in your system. And by changing just an entry in that registry, you can perhaps upgrade some parts of your contracts. There are other ways, such as contract call strategies, in which you can change how a function behaves. If that function is, for instance, executing an external call to another contract call strategy, and that strategy holds the actual logic to be executed by that function, right? So if you change the strategy, you, for instance, will change how that contract behaves. We saw an example of a strategy when we talked about in governance in Aave, for example. Many ways of using strategies. But for today, we are talking about proxy-based upgrades, right? I will assume many things around proxies and upgradability via proxies. I will assume that you know what a proxy is, and you will assume that you know what a delegate call is, that you have this idea of, well, there is a proxy delegating calls to an implementation, and by changing the implementation and changing where the proxy points, we can upgrade a contract. And if you are not familiar with any of those concepts, this talk might be a little bit over your head. I still want you to stay here because some explanation will be like from a more conceptual standpoint, so they will be super helpful for you as well. But if you're just starting out, there are many resources in the community, right? This is not the first talk ever about upgradability, and there are many links and resources that you can look and Google and then come back to this talk if you want to like go deeper into the security aspects of it. If you don't know where to start, I will start with this article called "The State of Smart Contract Upgrades," written by one of the brightest minds, Santiago Palladino, in the Ethereum ecosystem. It's a great article, and I encourage you to all read it and understand what was the state of smart contract upgrades. It's from last year, the article, but I still think that is super valid today. And probably many sections of this talk might be based on that article and many others in the community as well, right? The community has been like pushing lots of educational content around upgrades. Some of them linked here, but some of other things we will see particularly today. You might be asking, well, why are we even talking about this, right? We are just changing a feature in a system. It shouldn't be that complicated. If you come from building software in the traditional world, let's call it, probably you are just used to it, right? Developing a new feature and pushing that to production and yet another day in your life. In smart contracts, it's not that easy, and there might be some problems, right? It's not that easy to get upgradability right. We have seen many issues, and these are just like snippets of multiple issues that we have seen around upgradability. So it's probably not that easy, right? I'm talking about even security issues where there were actual vulnerabilities and funds were at risk and so on. But even like trying just to get it right, it's difficult, right? There are articles such as that from USDC that just explains all the steps they needed to take to do an upgrade in their contracts and the checks they needed to do and so on. So it's clear that, well, upgrading a contract is not as easy as we would expect, right? But the tooling is getting far better, the documentation is getting far better, the building blocks are getting so much robust and tested and well known. So I would say we are improving as a community, but there are still like lots of unknowns, right? Many new developers are joining the ecosystem. Many people might just be starting out to build smart contracts. So that might mean that they are not fully aware of everything that can go wrong, right? They don't know what they don't know. So it's important always to keep that idea in mind and try to shed some light into that. Hopefully this talk is a step in that direction. As always, well, not always, we didn't do this exercise last time, we are doing it today. I brought a simple example. I know it's just a function. Let's say this function is within a contract and it has a specific context in which it's executed, whatever. It's just an example, take it with a pinch of salt, but it's just to, let's use this as a trigger for the talk, right? As usually. We have a function that is called emergency upgrade, and apparently it's allowed to be called by somebody, which is the owner, and this function will take some tokens out and some funds out, and then will trigger the upgrade, right? So my idea here is, well, take your time, take 2 minutes to do this. I know it's a short time, but just 2 minutes, just as a mental exercise. Take local notes or whatever. No need to share anything in the chat. But what you can do is just try to spot issues, problems, things that may smell badly from this code. And you can use the knowledge that we shared in many previous sessions here, right? Today specifically is about upgrades, but in this code snippet, you will find many questions that you can ask if you have watched the previous sessions. So 2 minutes and we will reconvene and I will share my thoughts about this piece of code. Awesome. Hopefully you spot some perhaps code smells or issues or something along those lines. Again, just a personal exercise for yourself, just to get started with the talk. If you attended the previous ones, probably you also spotted issues or concerns, even questions around other calls, right? Because here we have some only owner thing, and we covered that on secure access controls. And here we have a token, and we covered that on the dangers of token integration. And here we have an oracle, and we also talked about in the dangers of price oracles. And behind that only owner, you could have like a governance system, and we covered that in the secure in the governance session that we did. So again, all of these topics get related, and we can relate them in just 20 lines of Solidity code, right? And we as auditors, security researchers, this is the kind of challenges that we have. In just one function, we can have all these pieces interacting with each other, and we should be kind of thinking from multiple angles what are the issues in here, right? So all the knowledge that I have been sharing with you in the previous sessions can be applied here as well. But we won't be doing that, right? We won't be doing that because we would be talking about this single function the entire day. It's just about questioning the code, right? As always, I will focus first on some things around the upgrade, but then we will go specifically on that line that said upgrade, right? But as I was telling you, we could start asking things like, again, what's behind the only owner? What are the trust assumptions that this contract is doing? What kind of tokens are we integrating in here? Could the kind of token that we are integrating with here, if it's any token, could that transfer fail and this emergency upgrade perhaps couldn't be triggered even? Could the owner of this contract handle the tokens that we are sending to it, or the ETH that we are sending to it? Could the recipient be able to handle ETH or not? Perhaps what if the recipient is a smart contract, doesn't have a payable function, and we are trying to push some ETH to it? Perhaps the upgrade could fail. What kind of oracle are we integrating with? Could that oracle introduce some unexpected attack vector on this emergency upgrade function that we are seeing? Are we even allowed to read from that oracle? Is the token that we are creating supported in this oracle? What is the unit? I mean, there are many things around oracles, right? We saw that. What if, I mean, we are kind of assuming that this contract has some ETH deposited, but what happens if there is no ETH deposited? Could this even fail or not? I mean, different ideas around that. To some extent, we might be trusting the recipient of this function, of this function code, like we are sending ETH to it. Perhaps this recipient could DOS this function, or perhaps could try to execute a reentrancy via another function. I mean, there are different trust assumptions in here as well. Having explored all of that, we can even talk about the last function call that says upgrade to. So if you focus specifically on that as a trigger for the talk, you might be asking, well, what's the actual upgradability pattern that's being used here? Because we are not seeing the rest of the contracts, right? Does this new implementation respect the storage layouts of the proxy, or depending on what's the upgradability pattern? Is the new implementation correctly initialized at some point? Does this new implementation need to have upgrade logic? Because if it doesn't have, you can perhaps break the next upgrade. Are there any kind of function clashing? We are going to be talking about that today. And other safety checks, right, to avoid breaking the upgrade, for example. And also, importantly, my question would be, what are the off-chain validations that this system have to make sure that this upgrade is going to be executed correctly, right? Are there any off-chain processes that need to happen for this only owner thing called this function and execute the emergency upgrade? Perhaps there needs to be something off-chain like testing or deployment scripts or that kind of things to be able to execute the upgrade, right? And that whole complexity could be hidden just in this upgrade to call. So we will be exploring some of that today. And we're going to be starting with initializers. We initialize with initializers. Let's say that we have this quick example like a proxy and an implementation. Let's say that the state of the system is held on the proxy, the logic is on the implementation, and the proxy is delegating call to an implementation, right? Usual stuff. The thing is, you shouldn't be including initialization logic in the constructor of the implementation, nor in the initial assignments, right? Because we know that with delegate call, everything that is in the implementation will be executed. We want to be executed on the context of the proxy, right? The state is on the proxy. If you have initialization logic that will just initialize the implementation contract and not the proxy, that's wrong, right? The proxy won't get correctly initialized. So for instance, in the implementation, you cannot have you cannot have constructors. And that means that, for instance, you also cannot have initial assignments. So this piece of code that you see here is not okay. I mean, if this is the implementation, you have a constructor, that's wrong. You are actually instead like kind of initializing this B variable, which is not okay, but you can have a constant, right? Because the constant will get deployed into the code of the implementation, not in the storage. But again, some like initial things that you should start taking into account. So you cannot have constructors, that's fine. So what can you do? So you have initializers, right? You have this initialize function that you will like see at this point in time just by de facto standard is called initialized, that will execute the initialization logic in the proxy's context, right? So you will trigger the initialize function targeting the proxy will delegate call to this initialize function implementation, and the whole thing will be initialized in the proxy context. So you may have this and you will say, well, this is okay, right? No, it's not okay, this. Just because you have replaced the constructor with a function called initialized is not enough. In this case, for example, anybody could like kind of recall this initialized function, right? Anybody could call it at any point in time. So probably this initialized function, just to start talking, should have some access controls. And we happen to have a session on access controls, so you can watch that session as well. So, well, you can go one step ahead and you will say, okay, I will use just the initializable contract from OpenZeppelin contracts that will give me this initializer modifier that I can put in a function. So I make sure that it only gets called once, which is to some extent okay, as long as you are the first one calling it, right? Because the question will be who can call it now and when. I mean, it's probably not going to be able to be called twice, but the first time should be the right caller. Otherwise, problems might come. So usually what you will see is that people will take kind of this approach of atomically executing the initialization, right? So deploying the proxy and calling the initialize function in the same transaction so that it cannot be from run, for example. What can go wrong with initializers? Well, we just covered a number of things, but we can also start asking what has gone wrong, because many of these things have gone wrong already in the community. So one thing is just forgetting to initialize a proxy. You have this proxy, you deploy it, and you just go away and think that everything is right, but you forgot to initialize it, so somebody else will initialize it for you. For instance, could become the owner or something like that, right? Which is a problem. So uninitialized proxies seems trivial, yes, but we have seen examples of that. Because it's not that simple sometimes, right? You might try to initialize it, but somebody else might front run you. If you don't do this atomically, you might deploy the proxy, try to initialize it, and if you don't have like the right logic in there, somebody might front run you and might initialize it for you. So that's problematic as well. So make sure to do this atomically and take these kind of things into account. Another thing with initializers is reinitializing the proxy. That means that, well, yeah, you tell, yes, Tincho, yes, I have initialized my proxy. Perfect. But wait, the initialize function now is unprotected. So somebody else, even if you have initialized it, will come and will initialize it again. Not good. And that might not be so obvious sometimes, right? Because let's take this piece of code. Let's see this example. You have an initialize function that is setting the owner, is making sure that when you call it, the owner is already the zero address, and you should be setting something different from the zero address. So this should make sure that the initialize function can only be called once. Perfect. And let's say that you do it atomically. Perfect. So nobody else will be able to do that, and you initialize it, you are the owner. Perfect. But then you have another function in another contract called renounce ownership that will let you just renounce ownership because you like decentralization and you don't want to be the owner of a contract. So you go ahead and you renounce ownership. And well, basically now anybody can come again and initialize your contract for you. In this case, I mean, there have been some examples around this in the community as well. So be careful. Ideally, you should be using like a special flag just to mark whether a proxy has been initialized or not. And you shouldn't be using like other state variables to do that, unless you are doing it like very consciously and you know exactly what you're doing. Otherwise, you might run into these kind of problems. And well, in this case, somebody else will initialize your proxy and your deployment will have failed. Another topic around initialization and how you set up the proxies and implementation contracts is what you can call like incompatible inheritance. Let's see examples of this. Let's say that you have an implementation contract that, well, you are inheriting from the initializable contract that we saw before, so that should be fine. But you are also making it ownable, so you want it to have an owner, and your ownable contract looks something like that. And what I told you before is that, well, you cannot have constructors. So this is another issue, right? In the base, in your inheritance change, you shouldn't be including constructors. And you might say, well, this is too obvious at first sight, but let's say that you instead do this, which is not okay as well. Let's say that now you are using the ownable contract from OpenZeppelin contracts in your upgradability pattern. And you inherit from this ownable contract. So you're not actually like kind of seeing the constructor, but the constructor is still there. It's something like this, right? So this is still wrong. What you should be doing here instead is using the upgradable version of OpenZeppelin contracts. There is a specific upgradable version of OpenZeppelin contract that you should be using if you are covering upgradable contracts. That is like kind of upgrade ready in this sense, right? In this case, for example, the ownable upgradable contract does not have a constructor, has its own initializer function. And there is some magic that the people maintaining the OpenZeppelin contracts have done, in which the upgradable repository of OpenZeppelin contracts is automatically created from the regular one, which is awesome. But yeah, you should be using this one, right, for upgradability. You might say, okay, this is enough, but no, this is not enough. There is a problem in here because we are talking about initialization chains, and probably you will have noticed there is something missing here. You are inheriting from this ownable upgradable, and you have an initialize function, and you are setting something in there, but probably something is missing, right? And yes, there is something missing. You're basically missing calling the initialization of the ownable contract. If you only have this, nobody is becoming the owner. If you have this, the deployer will become the owner. So not the deployer, but the caller of the initialize function. So be careful with these kind of things, because you should be respecting these initialization chains if you use these versions of upgradable contracts. In regular contracts, non-upgradable contracts, Solidity will just take care of calling the constructors of the base contracts that you're inheriting from. In upgradability, that's not true. So you should be manually calling the initializers. And there is another thing to consider when we talk about multiple inheritance. I told you this is not going to be easy. When we talk about multiple inheritance, in this case, let's say you have this implementation contract that is inheriting from contract A and B, and you see that these A and B are both inheriting from the base contract, and the base contract has a constructor that increments this ID by 1, right? Whatever. This is not upgradable, and Solidity will take care of just doing the right things for initialization. And you will see that at the end of the day, this ID, if you call this getter function, you will call the ID, and you will see that the ID is 1. If you want to replicate this in the upgradable world, you will have something a little bit more complex, and something like this, right? You have the implementation contract at the bottom, the inheritance from A and B, and since I told you that you should be replicating the initialization calls, you will be calling the initialize function of A and that from B. But if you actually execute this, you will see that ID is now 2. And that means that, there is some magic that Solidity, in non-upgradable contracts will do of linearizing the entire inheritance chain, so the constructors are only called once, and so on and so forth. That whole magic is taken away when we are talking about upgradable contracts, so you should be far more careful with initialization chains. And just checking, just making sure, just peer reviewing, and lots of testing should help you get this right. The scenarios could be quite edgy, but are there. And if you have like super complex initialization chains and inheritance chains in your upgradable contracts, this could become problematic at some point. So pay special attention to it. And you can read more in the link in there in OpenZeppelin documentation of the upgradable contracts. You will see some specific section talking about multiple inheritance. So take a look at that. We could also talk about uninitialized implementations, right? We have been talking about and discussing around initializing the proxy at the end of the day with the logic that is implemented in the implementation contract, but at the end of the day, what you are initializing is the proxy itself, the state of the proxy. But there are some issues around uninitialized actual implementations contract, the thing that's behind the proxy, right? But I'm not going to cover that now. We'll leave that to later in the talk, because first we should be talking about something else to fully understand uninitialized implementations. Now, bricked upgrades, and this is a fun topic. Because when you run upgradability, you might brick your upgrades, and that means that, for instance, you are not, once you upgrade something, you cannot upgrade again or something along those lines, right? Multiple things could happen. So let's first consider this. Let's say that you have this proxy and this implementation, and there is a usual question in the community, let's say, that discusses where the logic of upgradability should be in the proxy or should be in the implementation, right? If you put the upgradability logic, that means, for instance, the upgrade function, and you put that into the proxy, you will end up with the school of thought around upgradability that vouches for the transparent proxy pattern, right? In the transparent proxy pattern, I won't get into the details of it. Again, lots of material already in the community that you can read. There is a link in there. If you put the upgradability logic in the proxy, what you will get is immutable upgradability logic, right? You will have like a little bit more complex of a proxy, but the upgradability logic will always be there. Instead, you could choose to have like a more lightweight proxy and push the entire logic, even for upgradability, on the implementation. If you do that, you will end up with something along the lines of the universal upgradable proxies pattern. Again, lots of material in the community that you can read if you are not sure what I'm talking about here. So let's say that we are in this case, right? We're in the case of the upgradability logic is mingled with the business logic all in the implementation contract, and the proxy is just a lightweight proxy that, let's say, just delegates to the implementation. So what could happen in that case is that, well, you have a proxy and you have a V1 contract and you are willing to upgrade to a V2. And in the V1, well, you have the upgradability logic in the implementation, and you trigger the upgrade and you go to V2. And once you do that, you realize that the V2 does not have upgradability logic. You forgot to code it, for example. So what happens now is that you cannot upgrade anymore. So that's problematic, probably, because you wanted to have an upgradable proxy and this like the little nice features of upgradability, but you ended up with a proxy that cannot be upgraded anymore because you probably forgot to include the upgrade logic in the V2. This wouldn't happen in this case with the another pattern that I showed you, the transparent proxy pattern, in which you have the upgradability logic on the proxy. That other pattern has also some drawbacks, but this that I'm showing you here is like particularly problematic in universal upgradable proxies. And again, perhaps it's not that trivial to realize where the V2 has implemented upgradability logic or not, right? That could be perhaps on the inheritance chain, or perhaps you are taking that logic from other contract that you are not seeing or from external libraries. So perhaps it's not that trivial to realize whether a contract has the right upgradability logic or not. So what you will see in the OpenZeppelin contracts implementation of this pattern, the UUPS, what you will see is that what we do to avoid these kind of scenarios is this complicated logic that you don't need to read into details. But what I'm showing you here is that the actual function that triggers the upgrade will first kind of do the upgrade and attempt to do the setup, then we'll do a rollback, and that means trying to go back to V1. Let's say it goes to V2, then it attempts to go to V1. If the process of going back to V1 is okay, that means that you haven't forgotten to include upgradability logic, so that's fine. So it goes back again to V2, right? So it attempts a rollback, it makes sure that everything is okay, and then finalizes the upgrade. Of course, this comes with the trade-off of making contracts a little bit more gas inefficient, right? Because you are attempting something, then you trigger the upgrade, then you go back. I agree with that, but if this is what is required to make sure that your implementation contracts always can be upgraded, if this is what it takes, this is what it takes. And I think that staying secure in these cases is fundamental. So I just wanted to show these very nice features that is implemented on there in OpenZeppelin contracts. If you just use them and inherit from these contracts, you don't see this. This is like some magic hidden behind the scenes. But this is some of the ways in which using OpenZeppelin contracts can keep you safe. And I encourage you to go read the implementation. The actual implementation is interesting to note. But well, we can go back to initialized implementations now, because I was telling you earlier about initialized implementations, what could go wrong with that. So let's go back to that, right? We have a proxy, we have business and upgrade logic and implementation, and we do the usual delegate codes. But what happens if somebody directly calls the initialize function on the implementation contract, right? Because it's a contract, somebody could call it. Usually implementation contracts are not initialized because they don't matter, right? Ideally, they don't matter because the state should be held on the proxy. But at the end of the day, implementation contracts do matter, and somebody could initialize it. And if somebody can initialize it, for instance, could become, let's say, the owner of the implementation, could call this upgrade to uncall function, and that function will delegate call to an attacker control code that was set during the initialization, for example. And this attacker control code could have a self-destruct. And if that happens, you are delegating call to a contract that automatically self-destructs. So that means that you will be destroying, the attacker will be destroying the implementation contract. And that means that the proxy is already broken because it will be pointing to an account without code. And since we are in a UUPS context, the proxy doesn't have any upgradability logic. So now the proxy is totally broken and you are in trouble, probably. This is exactly what happened in a vulnerable implementation that we have in OpenZeppelin, that we had in OpenZeppelin contracts a few months ago, weeks, I don't know, time flies. But it's already fixed. There are multiple write-ups in the community explaining the scenarios of the vulnerability and how it was reported and how our team solved it. So anyway, it's just something else to take into account, this kind of scenarios. And what we are doing now to solve this issue is actually when you deploy this business, this implementation contract, it has like a very simple constructor that actually initializes the implementation for you. So you shouldn't be running into trouble in that sense. Perfect. Now, time to talk about storage layout. Another pressing topic when it comes to upgradability, and some issues in the ecosystem have been surfaced due to a storage layout. So we will cover that now. Well, here we go. Let's see this diagram. You have a proxy that delegates call to an implementation. In the proxy, you have, like in the code of the proxy, you have two state variables defined, one called the implementation, another one called the owner. which is something to some extent common to see in a proxy. And then you have an implementation contract that says that has initialized Boolean flag on a state, and also let's say it has a number or some other state values like that, right? Related to perhaps the business logic of the implementation. And you can compile this with Solsi, and you can use the flag called storage layout, and you will see something like this in the output, right? This is a little bit simplified, but it's just to make a point. You will see in the case of a proxy that the implementation variable, it says to be stored at slot 0, and the owner, it says to be stored at slot 1, right? This is just output from Solsi. You can do this in your own contracts, no magic in here. And let's go now to the other side of the screen. Let's go to implementation. You will see that when you compile it with Solsi using this flag, you will see that the initialized Boolean flag is stored at slot 0, and the number is stored at slot 1. So far, so good, perhaps, but remember that we are always in the context of delegate calls, and delegate calls are beasts that need to be tamed. What is happening here is that the entire logic, given that we are executing logic of the implementation contract in the context of a proxy, the entire logic of the implementation, even the state variables, will be kind of read and written in the context of the proxy, right? Not in the context of the implementation contract. So when you read and write, given that we are in this context of a delegate call, when you read and write this initialized Boolean flag, or when you read and write the number state variable, you will do something very bad, which is called storage collision. What you will do is you will actually read and writing from the implementation slot on the proxy, because they both share the slot number 0. And when you read and write from the number state variable in the implementation, given that you are on a delegate call and all the code is executed in the context of the proxy, you will actually be reading and writing on the owner slot of the proxy. So that's what we call, we security nerds, a storage collision. And that could be like very problematic depending on the very specific logic that you have in your contracts and how this is executed and the specific storage layouts of the proxies and implementations. But this is something very important to take into account. You must, and I'm going to tell you some recommendations around this in a minute, but you must take care of handling a storage layout properly. Very recently, there were some issues in well-known projects on mainnet that didn't follow all the necessary precautions when dealing with storage layouts and ended up having issues related to this. So please bear in mind these kind of things, and remember to, when you talk about upgradability, a storage layout should be like a very big warning in your head. So how do we avoid this kind of collisions, right? These collisions between this proxy and these implementations. Well, there is a well-known pattern already. It's an EIP in the community called this EIP 1967. That what you will if you follow this, and this is, I'm about to show you de facto standard by now that many projects are using. It's already kind of integrated in OpenZeppelin contracts as well. What you should be doing is moving to different extents the storage of the proxy so that it doesn't collide with the storage of the implementation. So what you are seeing in here is that in the proxy, we are moving the implementation address and the owner address to random slots in storage. You can do that with low-level solidity. So you move those to random storage slots. So now the storage layouts won't be overlapping and won't be clashing, which is awesome. And you have that, you can follow the CIP to read more about, to read the details and see how to implement it. Again, it's implemented already in OpenZeppelin contracts if you do the proxies in there. You can read more about the unstructured storage proxies. That's another way that you will find it. And though that pattern in proxies will let you avoid these proxy implementation storage collisions. So if you are going for this kind of setup in your contracts of upgradability, please make sure you are following this I would recommend this particular standard, which is the one that in audits, for example, I have seen implemented many times. Just one simple example, but this is just a snippet from the graph. For example, well-known project in mainnet, you will see that in their contracts, you will find the CIP being used, right? This is just one example of many multiple ones. I just wanted to show you one so you can at least trust me on this one. But yet, we are not done with storage collections. Sorry about it. There is something else we should be discussing here. There are other kind of storage collisions when we talk about like between versions, right? Between the versions of the implementation contracts that you are pointing your proxy to. Let's say that you have this V1 contract that is called implementation V1, and you have in state this super powerful owner state variable, right? Which of course will be set in the context of the proxy, right? But you're defining it on the implementation contract. You go and you upgrade to V2, and what you do is actually add another state variable, something that you might want to do in a new version of your protocol. That might make sense, right? Adding a new variable. But you do it in such a way that changes the storage layout. What you have done in this case is included this new state variable before the super powerful owner one. So now the random account address will be pointing to slot 0 instead of slot 1, which is probably what you wanted. So this could bring many problems, right? Because every time that you read and write from random account, you will actually be reading and writing to the value that in the proxy has this super powerful owner. So you must preserve storage layouts across upgrades. Storage layouts is something to really take into account. So you would ask, okay, let's do a flashback to the previous slide, and you would ask, okay, how hard can it be, right? Well, it's not that easy. You cannot change the types. Usually changing the type will change the amount of perhaps slots that your state variables occupy in the storage layout. So that would mean that if you change the type, you might be changing the storage layout. You cannot change the order and declaration of these state variables as the example we just saw. You cannot introduce new variables before existing ones. That's another thing you cannot do. You cannot remove existing state variables. Okay, so it's getting complicated, preserving storage layout. But you can always append new variables at the end of the storage, right? So you have, let's say, 10 variables written, and you add like the number 11 at the bottom, and you should be okay. But not in base contracts, right? If you do that in base contracts, you end up again changing the storage layout and causing problems in the entire inheritance chain. So preserving storage layout is not that easy. And in here, I'm showing you a link, again, OpenZeppelin contracts documentation. Actually, this is in the upgrades plugins that I will be talking later in the talk, where it has a specific section called writing upgradable contracts. And it has a section explaining you exactly what kind of changes you can and what kind of changes you cannot do, with examples, with step-by-step examples on how these things should be done. So please go take a look at that as well. Super insightful documentation. And that's why you will see things like this, right? Out there in the wild, in contracts, you will see people doing different kind of hacks to maintain a storage layout. For instance, in the first example, you see this gap state variable called, and that is, so you will see that, for instance, in OpenZeppelin contracts, or there I'm showing you a snippet from a contract in Aave. You will see that these gaps are there in state to reserve storage space so that you can continue adding storage variables, state variables, so that you don't clash if you do layout changes in the storage layout. Another approach, for instance, the one that Compound has taken, is having specific contracts where they define the storage for that version, and then all they need to do is inherit from that, add the new variables of the V2 in the new contract, and then do the same for V3, and then do the same for V4, and so on and so forth, right? So you end up with an inheritance change for your entire storage layout, which could be nice because it kind of encapsulates these state variables, but it also could hinder readability to some extent, right? Because if you want to find one particular state variable, you need to be kind of navigating the entire project to find it. I've been there, trust me. So different approaches, and they all serve the same purpose of handling storage layout carefully. We are just, this should be the last section, so about issues, then we are talking about more recommendations and tooling and documentation that you can read and so on. But I wanted to cover a fun topic for me, security researcher, which is called function clashing. And my question would be, where does this compile, right? I shared 1 week ago something on Twitter about this. So if you saw that, you already know the answer. But if you see this contract just at plain sight, perhaps you would say that this contract should compile, right? It's just Solidity 0.08. It's just a contract called example, 2 functions, whatever, right? But if you attempt to compile it, you will see this warning or error actually from the compiler that tells you that the signature hash collision. I won't get into the details on how basically the identifiers that Solidity builds for these functions are 4 bytes. Is the hash, I think it's the hash of the signature, and the first 4 bytes of that hash is the function identifier that Solidity uses to identify which function you are calling, for example. So you cannot have functions that clashes in those identifiers, right? You cannot have 2 functions with the same identifier. Even if their names in this case are different, at the end of the day, if you do that process of finding the identifiers for these functions, you will see they are the same. And this is the actual identifier, right? In 4byte.directory, you will find kind of a database, public database of function identifiers. And if you look for the identifier of the upgrade address function, you will see that it matches the one of these weird named function, which is awesome. And there are other examples of that. There are multiple examples of that. Here is one from transfer. You would say that transfer is a pretty well common function in contracts. And it has some function clashing as well. But the thing is, in here, sorry, let's go back here, is that, well, you cannot even compile this, right? So it shouldn't be problematic. Everything is in the same contract. You try to compile this, you have an error. It's just a matter, I don't know, changing the name of a function, right? And it's not that common usually, right? You should be quite lucky to actually have 2 legitimate functions in your contract in which you find a hash collision, identifier collision. But what happens if we move again to the upgradability context, right? We have a proxy and we have an implementation. What happens in the proxy, we have this weird named function, and in implementation, we have this function called upgrade, right? We already know those functions share the same identifier. You will be calling the proxy to trigger the upgrade. And instead of going through the fallback function, you will end up calling the first function in there, and you won't be able to trigger the upgrade that you want. And you will be executing just a function on the proxy. Again, very edge case. I would agree with that. But we should be careful, right? Still, it's just a matter of probabilities and could be problematic in some sense. So you should be careful with that. If you ever read about the transparent proxy pattern, it's a way of avoiding these kind of things. When you have upgradability logic, for instance, on the proxy, the transparent proxy pattern will let you avoid, with a nice tricks, to avoid these function clashing things. And beware, this kind of could be used for evil. A few years ago, I published a short article, and the people from Nomic had also published an article as well on how this function clashing could be used in some edge scenarios, but perhaps realistic in some sense, could be used for evil. So beware of those kind of things. Access controls. Now it's should be quite simple. I mean, we talked about upgrade functions and initializers and that kind of things. And all of those tend to be rather sensitive functions. So all of them probably will have some set of access control, right? But luckily for us, we already did a session on access controls to determine this question, right? Who upgrades? But we already did a session on access controls. You can find it on YouTube. We have a smart contract security guidelines on our blog that you can read if you are more like a reader or not a watcher. You can read the article as well. And you can read more about how to set up access controls for those sensitive functions in your proxies. So it's nice that we are kind of building this knowledge all together in the community. About tooling, okay, we still have some time. Yeah. About tooling, this is a long session, but hopefully insightful and super helpful for you. Tooling. Because the main question will be, how are you going to remember everything that we covered today, right? I mean, there are lots of things you should be taking into account, and probably the next time that you sit down to write an upgradable contract, you will be a little bit scared, perhaps, of what can go wrong. So, sadly, nothing can help you, and you are all doomed, and good luck writing upgradable contracts. But no, actually, we do have some tools for you. And the community has been, again, publishing lots of material and tooling around this. This is not new. So for instance, in OpenZeppelin, we have these upgrades plugins, which I super recommend you to check out and see where you can integrate them to your project. That will have kind of embedded checks in the function calls, for instance. Sorry, let me say that again. So in these plugins, what you will find is that you can trigger upgrades, for instance, in your test or in your deployment scripts through very simple interfaces, in JavaScript in this case. And it will have kind of embedded checks in these internal functions of the plugin that will make sure that your contracts are, for instance, compatible when it comes to storage layout, or that it has some initializer functions and that kind of things. Many of the checks that I told you about today are already embedded into this plugin, and I was using it to prepare for this session and kind of get a hand of it. And it's really cool, super easy to use. And I invite you to go read the documentation and see where you can integrate them into your projects. We are recommending them during even audits for the developers that we do audits for. So take them into account, super useful. You can use them on Hardhat, you can use them on Truffle. And again, many security checks already in there. It's all behind the scenes, and you just kind of click and it happens. Another one is how to upgrade contracts via multisig. There is documentation that you can check in OpenZeppelin Defender that will let you upgrade a smart contract, for instance, via multisig, which should be a pretty common use case. And there is a specific guide that you can check that will walk you through the entire process of, okay, how do I upgrade a contract via multisig, right? A pretty common question that at some point you will be asking. And you have, again, tooling and the OpenZeppelin Defender in there to help you. So I encourage you to check it out. And again, if you want to see tutorials of this and you don't like reading, again, go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/OpenZeppelin. It's super easy. And you have like workshops from our developers in there telling you how to manage smart contract upgrades, how to deploy efficient upgradable contracts. I mean, super insightful information that you can start checking out. And just because I don't want you to say that I only talk about OpenZeppelin, just kidding. You can use static analyzers tools, for example, right? So Slither, a tool from Tale of Bits, that I've been using in some audits, for example, and I think it's a pretty well-known static analysis tool in the community, has some upgradability checks, right? So you can use Slither in this case, for example, to compare two different implementations, and Slither will tell you where there are some problems when you execute, where there are problems between that implementation V1 and implementation V2, for example, right? And it has some embedded checks in Slither as well. So again, I encourage you to check it out. Slither might be a tool that you want to integrate into your CI pipeline or something along those lines. So perhaps you can check it out and see where it makes sense to your project as well. So another piece of tool that can help you stay safe when it comes to upgradability. So we are just wrapping up a long session today. Hopefully everyone has stayed here with me. We're already more than 40 people, so appreciate everyone staying. Some closing thoughts around upgradability, just to summarize what we have been discussing today. You will likely need to upgrade projects unless you are coding something, I don't know, super immutable and decentralized, and that you are just deploying it and never touching it again. You might need to roll out a fix or a new feature or something like that. So you have different ways. You have different ways of doing that. I covered those at the beginning. I mentioned them. You can explore them. You can study them. And you can actually learn from others and see how other people in the community are doing these kind of things, right? And you get to choose how, which is awesome. Proxy-based upgrades are here to stay. I know that some people in the community are not so sure or are not so, do not agree too much with the idea of upgradable proxies. They have their reasons. In my experience, they are useful, and I've seen lots of projects using them. We just need to be careful of them. We just need to handle with the necessary care. There's tooling, there are security checks. You can audit them. You can have peer reviews on them. You can test them. You should just be careful, right? Not afraid. It's a feature that you can integrate into your project, perhaps it can save the day one day if you need to roll out a fix. Then I talked at the beginning, but I just want to stress it here again, the known unknowns. There's lots of knowledge that we may have in the community around these kind of things, because we perhaps more advanced people when it comes to smart contracts have experienced that via audits or developing and so on. But let's remember all that there's new people joining in the ecosystem. We should be sharing with them what are the risks of these kind of things and what they can do about them. So remember, in everything that you do, there might be unknown unknowns. So do things with care and talk to other people in the space that can help you out. Throughout the entire talk, I told you about like many kind of must follow rules when it comes to upgradability. So it's not that easy to always be remembering all of them, and I agree with that. So there is tooling to help you with that, right? You can use them as your companions in your development process so that you are safer, you feel safer when you are coding these kind of things. And last but not least, I should say that usually when it comes to upgradability, we should not only be thinking about reviewing or auditing V1 and V2 only, but many times the problems come in the transitions from V1 to V2, for example, right? So let's take the example of a storage layout. I may audit V1 and I might tell you, yeah, okay, this storage layout is fine. And I will see V2. I may tell you, yeah, this is fine. But if I don't see V1 and V2 at the same time, and if I don't see the transition that you're about to do from V1 to V2, there's where the issue may come from. So let's remember to test these kind of transitions. Let's remember to have these deployment scripts make the necessary validations and checks to make sure these upgradability processes go right. And yeah, let's stay safe with these kind of things. Again, being careful, not afraid. If you want to learn more, a very somewhat old article in our blog, but it is super great if you're not familiar with this entire concept of proxies, and this talk was a little bit over your head. You can go to our blog and see the proxy patterns article. The writing upgradable contracts about upgrades plugins is like very interesting, and you will see many of the things that I talked about today are taken from there. And again, just want to stress this article called The State of Smart Contract Upgrades is fantastic, and really encourage you to read about it. Probably around upgradability, you will find many other resources in the community from very smart people out there publishing their different upgradability patterns and their weaknesses and drawbacks and advantages and strengths. It's awesome. I'm just here including a few, but if you look for upgradability out there, you will find lots of interesting material, and you can share that with me as well if you find something interesting. So that's it for today. This was the second to last session of the Secure Development series. We covered lots of things throughout the series. I'm very looking forward to continue sharing things with you on the last one. which is going to be quite interesting. We will see some like future outlooks of smart contract security. We'll do some summaries of the things that happened during the series. There will be a kind of a special gift for those attending that have attended all sessions. So really looking forward to closing this session, this series with all of you. And that will happen in 3 weeks, right? So you will be, if you subscribe, you will like kind of see all the relevant communications and information on how to join that when it comes. Remember, as we just told you at the beginning, we are hiring lots of open roles, open positions at OpenZeppelin. If you want to join us, the doors are open. Please apply. If you have any doubts or anything that you want to talk about before, if you're a little bit afraid of applying or a little bit shy, please reach out and we can discuss it and we can see what's the best role for you in OpenZeppelin. Because again, doors are open and we are really welcoming for the entire community. So thanks very much. A wild pop-up just appeared. Please scan it. You can scan it and claim it. It's there. Just you attended, you stayed until the end of the session. You're awesome. Thank you for joining us. And there you have the pop-up. There you have my socials. You can contact me via email, and you can check out more about OpenZeppelin and the kind of things we do for the security in our blogs and links that you have in there. So that's it for today. Thank you very much all. Probably there are questions, comments, ideas, and so on. You will receive a survey probably after the talk. Please complete it. It's the best way we have for continue improving this series, continue improving our workshops, the content that we deliver. It's the best way in which you can provide feedback and say the kind of things you like, the kind of things you didn't like, and what you want to see from us next. So it's really, if you can, please, it's super important for us, or for me at least, that you give us your feedback on those surveys that you will be receiving. So thank you very much. That's it. And let's see if there are questions, comments, and ideas, and that kind of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Cincho. And we had some questions answered by Pala, so thanks again. And those of you that are watching on YouTube, feel free to ask your questions. And there's 2 questions there.
Yeah, let me see those. Q&A here, okay. Nicolas Garcia asked, what's the best approach between those two, Abbe and Compound? I think that you, Nico, are referring to how they manage the storage layout. I would check them out both and see what's best for you. I'm not entirely sure if there's one best or the other, honestly. I would check them out both and see what makes sense in your project and what you're comfortable with, and which one is the easier for your community to contribute to, and what is the easier for your team of developers to understand. I don't have a favorite, honestly. But again, 2 big projects that are using them, so you can choose between them and see what makes most sense for you. I know it's kind of a generic answer, but honestly, I don't have like a strong preference between the 2. It's just a matter of keeping the layouts safe. So you can go with one of them, or you can choose, but always remember to test what you do and to make sure that everything is looking safe and safe, actually. Yeah, so that should be the answer. Perfect. And Jimmy has another question. Let's see that. What are the advantages of combining store and proxy as opposed to using something like Gemini dollar pattern? Are these more gas efficient? Whoa, I'm not familiar with the Gemini dollar pattern, honestly, Jimmy. Sorry about it. I will take a look at it and we can discuss it offline probably. So if somebody in the audience is more familiar with this pattern and want to share something in the chat, please go ahead. Otherwise, Jimmy, we can connect again offline and we can talk about it if I can find something about it. There's another question on the chat by ElixXOCP. Do you test it in Lyco and then upgrade, or we can be confident from a hard hat simulation? By a hard hat simulation, I'm not entirely sure if you refer to just kind of in the hard hat local network or just running a local fork using hard hat. I will start with just local testing. Should be easier to set up, should be easier to manage. I would, if you have something set up to go to Koban or a public test net, it's probably usually, and I have seen projects do that, like going in there as well, testing things on a public blockchain, seeing how your deployment scripts react and how they deal with these perhaps anomalies or hiccups that these chains may have. And also testing against a local fork of mainnet on your local environment should be really, really good as well. And I've seen projects do that. And I've seen the consequences of projects not doing that. So having that kind of test set up, I'm not saying it's easy. Sometimes if your project is like huge and super complex, it won't be that easy, but I think at the end of the day, it pays off because it helps you be more safe in software. Jake is asking, OpenZepp have a Discord server? Yes, I think we do. We also have a Telegram group. And I don't have links here. I don't know which is you have some links at hand to share.
Yeah, I'm just pulling them up now.
Yeah, perfect. Jen has another question. What are your thoughts when an implementation is upgraded from V1 to V2 and then V2 has a change in an abstract contract it implements? A brief example. Before implementation is base B. Implementation is base B, V2. Let me see. I show some examples throughout the presentation around inheritance change and how you should be taking care of two main things, I would say, like the initialization chain, making sure that every initializer of the base contracts are always called in the right moment, at the right time, with the right parameters, and making sure there are no like duplicate calls to those initializers. And on top of that, making sure that the storage layout on this V2 that you have continues to be safe, right? So if you change, in this case, base B, making sure that that change in base B is not affecting in any way the storage layout of the final implementation. So making sure that is still correct and it won't cause any clashes or some ugly things like that.
That's great. I think that's all the questions. So
awesome.
we can wrap up.
Okay, thank you everyone then for joining. Yes, Santiago, the Spanish usually gets in the way. Thank you everyone for joining. See you in the next one. Really appreciate you being here. Yeah, let's connect offline then.
Yeah, great. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the forum. And I've also linked the next registration for the last workshop. So see you then.
Awesome. Bye-bye.